do. Let's do it, eh? It's just gone past. Olivia, Aurora. I've got a few other names down here, but you two? Cool. Awesome. Welcome along. And yep, heaps been happening in this space, of course. So I'm looking forward to your overview from both of you. So thank you. I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Nice to see everybody again. So today's changes, we're going to talk through the recent Resource Management Act changes. And particularly we'll be focusing on what those changes are, the implications and how we're responding as an organisation. You'll be aware that the government has an ambitious resource management reform program, and so we will see change continuing to happen over the next 12 to 18 months. And we will need to respond to the changes as they come through and then respond to also new proposals going forward. So just to be aware of that. In terms of what we're going to cover in this briefing, I'll cover out the key changes to the resource management system that affect us as an organisation, our partners, resource users and communities. I won't speak to the other changes that affect sort of central government processes and policies, but just be aware there are changes in that space too. But we will focus on our response as an organisation. And as I mentioned, other changes are on the horizon, particularly at the end of this year and early next year, that we will need to be preparing for. So just in terms of a very brief overview, the Resource Management Amendment Act did pass into law on the 24th of October, and it amended both the Principal Act but also secondary legislation prepared under that Act. So 5 instruments there, and there's a range of sort of targeted amendments. I will just note that we will expect to see further change around some of these instruments next year, and the extent and substantiveness of those changes will possibly be larger. And to note that most changes came into force from the 25th of October, so that was the date after the Act came into law. And as an organisation, we are required to implement those changes now, and we are required to implement those changes in relation to existing consents and processes. So our consents teams have been doing that, and of course those changes do have impacts for consenting, planning and regional delivery functions, for our partners and for resource users and communities. Part of our process here will be to work through with Papatipu Runanga environmental entities on how we operationalise those changes, and it will require some changes to processes as we go forward. We're also looking to make sure that we communicate those changes to the public so they are aware of what impacts these changes have for them. And following this briefing, we'll be having the key messages published on the council website or early tomorrow morning. Now, the next 3 slides focus on the pause to the freshwater planning process. I'm aware that Council had a briefing on this yesterday and were asked to make a decision on the matter. So if it's okay with the Chair, I suggest perhaps we move past those slides and on to the Te Mana o Te Wai change, but happy to be guided by you on that.
Yeah, how's everyone feel about that? Move forward.
And maybe this comes a little further down into the presentation, but one of the key things that I want to actually know more about is around the changes to the RMA, what that means when we revise our work plan with Papatipu Runanga, and what is the policy or new policy around that inside this organisation. Kia ora.
Yeah, but happy for you to go to the Te Mana o Te Wai, but let's go. And we'll get to that. Nope.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Kia ora. And we've got Aurora here to help talk through some of the operationalising of those changes and our processes around that. But I'll go through the presentation as it is currently. So I'll skip to the Te Mana o Te Wai change. So you'll be aware that the government was proposing to exclude the Te Mana o Te Wai hierarchy of obligations from consent processes. So that's consent applications and consent decisions. That change has passed into law. And just as a refresher, the Te Mana o Te Wai hierarchy of obligations forms part of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. It does set out a hierarchy which prioritises the health and well-being of freshwater bodies and ecosystems over other uses. So second order priorities are essential health needs, and third order priorities are cultural, social and economic well-being. What that change means is that consent applicants must not include an assessment of that hierarchy when they put their application in for consent, and our consent decision makers must not consider that hierarchy when making decisions on applications. It is directive and it is a requirement on us now, and we are implementing that change from the 25th of October, and there will have been applications in process that we will have had to apply that change to. But I do just want to point out that Te Mana o Te Wai has been part of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management since 2014. The concept has been evolved over time, but it has been in place for the development of all our freshwater plans to date. And that includes our sub-region plans, all the way from PC1 up to Plan Change 7. And so throughout that process, we have been implementing the concept of Te Mana o Te Wai, including through how we work with mana whenua and communities in developing freshwater plans and in setting limits.
Just to be clear, that was as a value that sits equally among the other values up until 2020, wasn't it?
So in terms of the difference there, the 2014 MPSFM recognised Te Mana o Te Wai in terms of the national significance of freshwater and the relationship of tangata whenua to freshwater. The 2017 freshwater management MPS went a step further and recognised that there was an objective and we needed to protect the freshwater values. And then the 2020 was the one that implemented that hierarchy and prioritised the use and the health and protection of wellbeing of freshwater over the other uses. So it's been iterative through that time. So in terms of what this means, I just want to be clear that any of these changes that have happened around the consenting process don't affect the content of our existing freshwater plans, including those that give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. What it does mean, though, is that because our freshwater plans have implemented Te Mana o Te Wai in their development, we are not requiring consent applicants to include a separate assessment against the MPSFM Te Mana o Te Wai provisions. They will, however, still need to assess proposals against other relevant RMA provisions, including Part 2, other relevant parts of the MPS, and that includes specific provisions relating to consenting, particularly around wetlands and river management, and of course they still need to consider our freshwater plans and iwi management documents. In terms of how we're responding to the change, so on Friday, the Runanga chairs were advised of the key changes to the RMA, and that this will mean a need to revise how we work with them how we work with the Papatū Runanga environmental entities in our consenting processes. We are in the process, and we can talk about this a little bit more afterwards, but we're in the process of setting up conversations. So we have conversations set up for between the 2nd and the 10th with those entities, and we can take some more questions on that later if you like. But we have indicated that we are looking to implement a partnership approach around this. And in terms of key messages for consent applicants, one thing we have strived to do is be really clear around what they need to include in their applications and what they don't. But we're also mindful that there's a need to make sure that they continue to talk to potentially affected parties before lodging applications, or at least we can encourage them, and that there are still tests that apply in relation to RMA notification tests. So all of those things still stand as they were.
Are we doing that in retrospect to people who might have been discussing consent applications in September or earlier in October than the 25th of October date?
Yes, in short. So the changes apply to all applications. At the time that this change came through, we had around 900 applications in process. So the change applies to all of them, because prior to this, applicants and us needed to do the assessment against the legislation as it was. And we've now needed to move for all applications that are in the system and the pre-application, those in the pre-application space.
So they've all those 900 applicants have been told of the change, yeah, or they should have been, yeah.
As they work through the process, yes, they have. Yeah.
So it doesn't matter about the lodgement dates of those applications. It's that if they're not decided yet, they're all okay. Cool. Seems like quite a lot of work. Okay. Okay, cool. Do you have a question, Nick? No. It's all good. Karen.
And I might just add in at this point, in terms of our communications plan on this, we have been communicating to the resource management practitioners, consultants. We've got the key messages, and we will be doing comms around communicating these changes through usual communication channels, such as rural newsletters, etc., just to make sure that the messaging does get out. So the next change relates to a change for providing a consent pathway for discharge permits. So Section 107 of the Resource Management Act has now been changed to provide a consent pathway for discharge permits and coastal permits where significant adverse effects on aquatic life exist. Just want to be clear that the change that's come through the legislation is to provide a pathway. It sets limitations around when that consent might be granted, and there's 3 conditions that are at play. Effectively, there has to be a significant adverse effect on aquatic life in the receiving waters. The consent authority has to impose conditions on the permit, and that consent authority has to be satisfied that there will be a reduction in effects over the duration of that permit. And so this really is to provide a pathway, but it is not a guarantee of consent. Again, this change applies from the 25th of October, so it applies to applications in process. And relevantly, this particular change has retrospective application to consent decisions that were the subject of judicial review proceedings. And the one that this applies to is the consent decision relating to the application by Ashburton Lyndhurst Irrigation Limited for a discharge permit to discharge contaminants to land from farming. So as I said, this change does not mean consent will be granted in each instance. Our consent decision makers still have to have regard to a range of matters, including the quality of the environment, our relevant planning instruments, and the effects of the activity. And also this change does not affect notification tests, so we should expect that some consent applications may still require limited or public notification. As I mentioned, it does have implications for the reconsideration of that application by ALIL. That application was referred back to the Council by the High Court, and currently that application is scheduled for a hearing in February 2025. And so this change will be relevant in the context of that new decision that is coming up.
Yep, Genevieve.
So effectively, is it operating currently on a 124, or is it still operational, that consent?
They're currently operating under the old consent, and as you correctly touch on, under Section 124, so that provides them continuation rights until a decision has been made on their new application.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Grant.
Thanks, Olivia. My question's to do with the discharge pathway. Is there anything in the revised legislation that makes a requirement of the applicant to prove or assess the quality of groundwater health as part of the application, and then ongoing requirements in terms of monitoring? Is that at their cost?
So there's nothing specific in the legislation, but the effects of the activity and the condition of that receiving environment are standard things that would be required to be included in an application for consent. And in terms of the monitoring requirements, no, there's nothing specific. However, that requirement to impose conditions that will require the consent authority to be satisfied over the duration of the life of that permit that there is a reduction in effects, that is a lever, I guess, for looking into monitoring conditions.
Great, thank you.
Olivia, just the retrospective nature of it, is it like a time frame on that, or how have they defined how far that goes back and stuff?
Try one more. There's no time frame. What it is that they've clearly put a scope around it. So it has to be an application that was the subject of a judicial review proceedings, and there's only one, as far as I'm aware. Yeah. Yeah. So obviously we've also been communicating out to any consent applicants who may be affected by this change. And the other one point I want to touch on is that aside from the reconsideration of ALIL's consent application, we also have a live appeal to the Court of Appeal on the High Court's original decision. That appeal is scheduled to be set down for July 2025. And of course, Council will be considering these changes in terms of any next steps they may wish to pursue in relation to proceeding with that appeal. So just to be clear, there's two things at play.
So, considering the fact that that appeal still has to be heard, could there be, this is a long shot, could there be some case law coming out of that then has another change required in terms of assessing those consents?
Don't know that I can answer that sort of. Chris,
I guess, can I just
yeah.
fill it out a bit more? I think one of the things that when we were looking at this that came through, especially from the advice that we got from Wynne Williams on this, was the cumulative effect of consents and how the High Court or the court is really concerned about that. The evidence is that although individual consents may sit where they sit and be judged on what they are judged on, then the cumulative effect of consents and therefore the discharge is something that needs to be considered also, but hasn't been considered. So, I mean, I guess that's where my question's heading is. And don't answer it, actually. Don't answer it.
No, it's all right. Well, Stephanie can respond.
Thank you. Just to help the team a little bit, Councillor, completely understand that question, and it's right to have it. If I might just be able to take all our legal advice back through to you in a PX session for obvious reasons, and I will do that.
I think that's a certain concern that I have about our future, is that although we might be skipping through some of these things in terms of serendipity and some political help, at the end of the day, the cumulative effect of what the activities that we are under control of are going to be judged somewhere along the line, and that will have a substantive effect on where we're at. And I mean, I don't know if you can get any, until it's tested in law, I guess you can't get any definitive answer to that, but I think it's something that we should have in the back of our minds.
Understood.
Yep, Ian.
Just a follow-up question: has in terms of the government's intervention in Section 107, did they reflect on what is a significant effect on aquatic life, or do we have a definition of that?
No, they haven't. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, we haven't taken a position on that. So those terms are still broad and undefined at this point. Yep.
So at the moment, that sits with the hearing commissioner to assess that based on evidence that's presented in a hearing.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose when we did discuss this last time, I mean, my concern here is that for most of the last 35 years that regional councils have been around, they haven't been required to do fish monitoring as part of state of the environment reporting. So we don't have great data. So I'm assuming, do we use experts and when we do our section, whatever they are, reports?
Yeah. So our section 42A reports and our section 95, so notification and substantive decision, do rely on expert evidence or expert technical input if it's in the standard consenting process that's going through to a hearing, that's when it's more expert evidence is put forward.
Cool. So we normally externally get that evidence?
Depends on the matter that's being considered. If we've got that expertise in-house, we generally try and use our in-house expertise, keeps costs down for applicants, and we often have a better understanding of what's going on in the receiving environment. But if it's something bespoke or there's capacity, then we do go external.
Cool. Thank you. Genevieve?
My concern is, I guess, that if we don't have a determination or a scope for degraded water bodies, it could effectively be used anywhere here. So I guess we really need to rely on the hearing to have that determination. But yeah, that's my concern, is that it could be utilised in any shape or form in any water body if we don't have some sort of defined definition.
I might add some, just respond to that too. I think the sort of broad drafting in the legislation recognises that the significant adverse effects tests will need to be contextualised against the values in that receiving environment and the particular water quality that exists. And one thing I think we just need to be live to is that sometimes when we try to pin down definitions, we can sometimes result in perverse outcomes with things being missed, and sometimes that expert evidence process provides the most robust assessment of what an adverse effect might be in that particular context. And that's, I think, the basis for the reason you don't see some of these broad terms defined in legislation, because they are contextualised. Yeah.
Cool. I know we have some work to do in that regard. Yeah, I'll go to Grant. We have some work to do in relation to that sort of whole monitoring of fish sort of space. So, and who is that? Tim's team leading that currently? And I know that's obviously on our work program. So I'm keen to get that update so we understand how that works. Because through that, I'm assuming some standards may be set around what healthy fish in waterways looks like. I mean, it was part of the NOF and all that, but is that what we're doing? Just trying to understand.
I might need to take that away and come back to you just with some more detail on what we're doing on that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I might be able to. Chair, you're quite right, and it has been a challenge for us because there is no definition of which fish or what they are, what we've been doing to date, and I will have Dr. Davey come back with a more specific answer, but certainly what's been done is to be able to work with those parties that are already providing data so that we have that, and then they were working through the gaps to see what needed to be done. How far that has gotten, I'm not quite certain, but obviously in the context of the NPSFM 2020 being put on hold in many ways, those attributes sit in that, if I'm not mistaken. And so a question that we as officers have is, what will those attributes look like in a future NPSFM?
Cool. Thank you. Ian?
I don't want to claim to be an expert on anything, especially given the cock-up I made last night, which some people in the council table know about. Nothing to do with ECAN, just old age. But I served on the National Objectives Reference Group, and so the science around the effects of different water quality attributes on fish life is actually quite well known. And so I assume that when you're measuring the adverse effect, and whether it's significant or not, is more to do with water quality attributes rather than actually whether there are any fish present, because if you have the right mix of water quality attributes, then regardless of whether there are fish there or not, it will still be healthy or otherwise for the fish life. So that was the message we were given by the top water scientists and fishery scientists in New Zealand.
I think that's one way to look at it, Ian, but what could have happened, so you might have good water quality at a certain point in time, but you might not have had it in a previous time where fish were then killed or they were taken out of that system and now they're not back. So I think, attributes are important and that's part of the mix, and we already do that monitoring, so that's good. It was that you should actually look at the biological indicator that's in water as well, which is the life that lives there, both invertebrates and fish. And if they're not there, you still got a problem.
And that's why MCI is one of the attributes that is included. But I note, so if you take the Ashburton River as an example, there aren't many salmon in the river because the RDR tends, well, she's going to do quite a lot of water dumping this year, but in the last 20 years it hasn't done much water release, which tends to carry the signal for salmon to run up the Ashburton, but it is full of sea-run trout, which is an indication of health. So, from a fisheries perspective. So then it depends on what you measure, what fish species you're measuring and stuff. So you have Peter Trollope coming in here and saying, "Oh no, smolt or whatever they are." But in fact, there are plenty. When Tim Davies' team has done fish surveys in the lagoons on the Rikaya, the Rangitata, there's lots of the other smelt. So, we don't understand that nuance, I guess, but there are,
Sure, and that's probably why I think, I'm sort of pushing that. I think our expertise in that area over time, we should probably go there because we need, this is bringing it to a fore. I think we agreed on this, Ian, last time, that if we don't know what a significant impact on aquatic life means and looks like, then how the hell are we going to grant consents based on that matter unless we know, and we can be as sure as we can be in terms of our advice that we give to those hearings. So I think that's a really important part. Whether it's in the NOF or not going forward, I think it's still important. And whether that's not something we do internally, but it's an external thing, this is bringing it to a fore because as a matter for consideration with a consent application, we need to know as much as we can. So I just think it's a big area of that we need to do more work on going forward. I've got Grant online too, and then I'll come back to you, Dion, if that's all right. Grant?
My question was going to be in the same vein, really. Is this an opportunity for us to plug a gap in our knowledge, but also bring together the various water quality nitrate level type thing? We know that in the FM 2020 there's a limit of 2.4 milligrams per litre. But some of our PC plan changes have higher levels. Is this an opportunity to understand that and bring all of our levels and attributes to a common base? I'm particularly worried about the lack of information or perceived lack of information about our aquatic life in the groundwater. And the effect on crustacea. And I just don't know whether we have enough information about that. Looking at the Heinz Hekia current application, an area peppered with wells trying to dilute the effects of intensification. So I think there is an opportunity here for us to possibly proceed with a plan change to deal with that.
Can't do that at the moment, really. But
no,
Dion.
Thanks. This is interesting stuff, and Ian, I'm not going to pretend to know half of what's going on in this space because it is really fast moving. But one thing that I'm quite interested in with the conversation we've just had, in this point especially, is in the phase 3. Projected what they're going to be doing with the RMA, 8.5 in there is really quite clear around the shift from the system, from the focus from ex-ante consenting to strengthened ex-post compliance monitoring enforcement. That's a big change. And that kind of goes back to the guts of what Craig and what's been said here is if we don't know what we don't know, how are we going to be doing consenting in the future? And it kind of hits to the heart of this potential issue right now that we're facing. And so where does the role move from the consenting space to the compliance and monitoring space? And, science is obviously a big part of that as well. So I see a bit of a gap there, and I'm not sure, are we moving in that direction?
I think as an organisation we're very live to the fact that the government has signalled that change from consenting to compliance. Obviously there are still proposals to be fleshed out and we're expecting those proposals to come into Parliament probably middle of next year. We are thinking at the moment, what does that sort of change shift mean for this organisation and where are the sort of opportunities in that space? So it is something that requires a bit of thinking going forward. we do expect that as part of that regime, the government is looking to sort of provide some more effective compliance tools and mechanisms as well to support that shift. And I think that all those decisions are things that have to be thought over in the next 6 months as we look at that shift coming in. Yeah.
Just to ask a follow-up question on that is, my fear at the moment is that with the move to an ex-post compliance and monitoring, is if we don't hold the data and somebody asks for a consent or is applying for a consent and we don't have that data, then we might not have any grounds to potentially decline those consents, and without further monitoring and compliance after the fact that they've already been granted the consent. Is that something that am I thinking this in the right direction, or am I thinking?
I think most conditions of consent, the data does come to us. So,
but if it's not there,
I think it's normal that it does come to us because that's stipulations of consent. I mean, consent holders may have their own data they collect as well, but the key data that's stipulated in the consent would come to us.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, but
yeah, this is hard stuff. It's going to change. Yeah.
But whether that data is like readily available all the time when we need it is probably another matter, because it's coming in the door all the time from thousands of consent holders. So that I could understand for us that could be a challenge. But Stephanie wanted to make a point.
Chair, you're spot on. I mean, this is one of the leapfrog questions around technology. About how you gather that data and put it together, remembering that when we had the sustainable consents delivery, the question around AI, the key part of AI, if we were to utilize it, is the data coming in, the conditions, and then the ability to almost traffic light red, yellow, green. The ability to do that at the moment is confounded by virtue of how these come in, the number of consents, the old conditions. But what we're the brave new future, if you like, is that you could change that. And certainly we're live to that. The other two comments that I would make is councillors have received briefings and updates on the fact that we're working on compliance, re-skinning compliance completely, and we're doing that in the context of what might be coming, so that's one thing. And councillors will also receive a strategic think piece with regard to the changes upcoming before year end, so you can take that away for happy holiday reading, and we will have further conversations in the new year, so you're well prepared for the kinds of changes that Olivia and Aurora are speaking about today.
Ian? And then I'll call you.
I think I'm on the same topic as Dion was asking questions about, really, and that is that certainly my understanding from lots of consent applicants is that they're being asked to show the science around their consent application. And some of the criticism that I hear is that as a council, we're asking neighbours to repeat the same science in their consent applications, rather than this council saying, well, actually, we're comfortable with the science with applicant A, and that should apply to applicant B. But in fact, we're actually asking those applicants to repeat that same information. And that was a comment made at the gravel huies, for sake of argument, and quite a lot of other consent applications. So, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting dilemma that I guess you find yourself in, Aurora.
Yeah, the reality of the legislation that we work in and the privacy elements of people's individual applications do play a really big part there. So it's, on the face of it, it does seem like a simple conclusion to jump to, that if you're dealing with neighbouring properties, surely that the science should be the same, and why can't we just blanket approach it? It's a lot more nuanced than that. So there's the underlying privacy elements, there's the requirements in the Act where applicants need to specify what the effects of their individual activity are going to be, and that requires them pulling together a case using the science available. What we have tried to do, and where we will be moving to more next year, and particularly in the light of how it interacts with compliance and the state of the catchment that we're working as regulators in, is setting up the wider context of what's going on in the receiving environment for catchment-specific areas, where we know that there's a lot of applicants that will be going through the consenting process at the same time, so that we can get efficiencies through that before they come in, and then individual applicants can pick and choose what science applies to their activity. and provide that in their application. But the way that the law is set out at the moment, it does need to be considered individually. So that's why there is and I acknowledge that it is frustrating for people, where we go back and say, can you please tell us about this? But we are trying to improve our transparency there for the catchment approach.
Thanks, Ian. Nook.
Tēnā kōrua, Livia, Aurora, Tia mana. I'm finding this kōrero really immensely frustrating, actually, because a lot of this, and looking at the change in legislation, and really when we look at it, it is actually taking away mātauraka Māori. It's also taking away the influence, actually, and the information that is held by Papatupu Runanga. And I hear the conversation here talking about scientific data. I hear the conversation here trying to identify species and that, where all you need to do is go back through to the iwi management plans or even before that, and it will tell you actually that, and again, it's about mātauraka Māori. We've heard one kind of part of this discussion, but as the chair has said, there's a number of other factors that are involved in this as well. My whole sort of concern about this now, after listening to even 15 minutes of this conversation, is that, and it's all about operationalising, the changes. And the first thing about it, is the legislation really clear? And is it actually what we're talking about here? Are we actually clear on the fact that, this is how you're going to operationalise it? The feeling is that Papatupu Runanga are starting to feel isolated already around this. And then the discussion here is actually about not talking about mātauraka Māori, not talking about mahinga kai species or anything like that. And then the other part of it, are we doing this also because one of the biggest issues that you possibly have identified or whatever is actually the slowness of Papatupu Runanga to actually provide information? So this legislation helps you address the backlog of consents, because there's actually one part of it that is actually going to be put to the side because of the legislation. So I don't know why we're not talking also about other parts. It's just not scientific data. It's actually mātauraka. It's about historical. We can tell you what those waterways look like, actually, even 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 years ago. And that is where our starting point is. But we don't actually hear that. I'm not hearing that here, and I'm kind of really worried now that suddenly the conversation, the implementation, the operationalising of all of this is actually going to take out a real key part of this. And maybe I don't want to hear the fact is that a lot of it is because of the slow responses that you're possibly getting from Papatupu Runanga. Some are doing it better than others. But that's my concern here, and that's my addition to this conversation, because there is some real fear out there now, and particularly on how this organisation will possibly operationalise things. Yep.
I think I've seen some of those responses come through from the PREs, so the Runanga environmental entities. So yeah, there is concern, and it's as a change, so this is going to have to be worked through. But the mātauranga will still stand, because there is still the other parts of the Act where that can be applied to. So it's just not as specific as what it was. So I think the opportunity is still there to be able to uphold those key values. I did think of another thing in terms of the whole consenting process. One thing that might be important and this will come through the Regulation Hearing Committee, of course, is, for those type of consents, that having freshwater fish experts as hearing panel members could be pretty critical. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to respond to some of those concerns there, the consideration of Mataranga Māori is still a requirement in the MPSFM. It would still guide the development of planning processes. It's also still a requirement in relation to compliance monitoring and science and data. So I just want to give those assurances. So next set of changes relate to farming changes. And first one being intensive winter grazing. So National Environmental Standard for Freshwater has been amended. And you might recall that under the NES, there were regulations in place to manage intensive winter grazing. When those proposals first came out from government, they looked to revoke them in entirety. And in the council's submission, we raised concern that there might be a regulatory gap that starts to get exposed if those regulations were revoked. And so what the government has done is now put in place replacement regulations. And those replacement regulations address some of the concerns that particularly industry had around the previous set. They were quite ambiguous and they were difficult to enforce. And so the replacement regulations now have clear setbacks that are required to water bodies and requirements to maintain vegetative cover. And also just to be aware that under the previous regulations, if you didn't comply with them, you could still apply for a resource consent. That's not the case now. Those regulations must just be met, and those change comes into force on the 25th of October. So we did have some applications in process at the time, and those applicants have been informed that consent is not required, but compliance with the regulations will be.
Ian, you got a question?
So for those who did apply for consents, and I think most of the major irrigation schemes did, do the consent conditions still apply, or do they revert to the new changes?
Couple of ways to break that down. So there are consents that have gone through the process and been issued before this change. And if they are interlinked with a land use consent, then those conditions will still apply. If it is a standalone intensive winter grazing consent that's been issued as a land use consent but specific for intensive winter grazing as opposed to a whole farming activity, then those consents are still valid. It is up to the landowner if they want to retain those consents or surrender them. But they still would, there would be an interaction that they'd need to consider about what they have in their individual consent and the new regulations. Those consents that have been issued will remain valid. And the applications that were in process through these changes, so there were 13 of them, we've contacted all of those applicants and said, what would you like to do? It's changed, and I believe all of those have withdrawn. They've opted to withdraw those applications and go with the regulations.
And one further follow-up question is, part of the previous government's requirements were flyovers, I think, weren't there? Wasn't that a requirement, or was that just part of our own decision as to how we might monitor?
I believe that was just, it wasn't a requirement. Yeah.
I thought it was a requirement, but as I understand it, they've been quite well received by industry and in terms of trying to make sure that everybody's lifting their standards. So will there be an intention to try to perhaps work with industry and agree to continue with that?
I think that you would probably be closer to the conversation about how it's being received by industry. I guess we will be looking at all of our responses here in light of the regulations and saying, what's the appropriate response going forward and how do we do that? Yeah.
So just to be clear, is it in effect like permitted activity as long as you meet the standard, and then there's no ability to apply for a consent beyond that? Is it? What's that called in the RMA? Because it used to be discretionary and controlled and all that. It's sort of an interesting way to do it. Yeah, but good.
Yeah, permitted activity provided you do it like that.
Yeah.
Now I just would.
And then prohibited beyond that, effectively. That's what it's saying, isn't it?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Okay.
do just need to point out that in some instances, applicants may need to assess their intensive winter grazing as part of their overall land use activity when they're applying because of some interactions with our plan rules. But it would be in light of what the new legislation has said as a permitted activity. So do expect that people might still need to tell us about their intensive winter grazing activity if they're applying for their overall land use consent, but it would be lined up with, we would expect it would be lined up with the regulations.
Cool. Peter, do you have a question?
Oh, yes, my question really is that, so most of these things are going to be captured by farm environment plans, obviously, in terms of monitoring and enforcement. So farm management plans, they still exist, and are they a possible mechanism also for people to get followed up on? And my understanding was on farm management plans that they were non-statutory pieces, but we could call them in. Is that still applicable?
Yeah, so in our plan we have farm environment plans that apply to the consenting process. We also had a schedule at the back of the plan around sort of lower intensity activities for requirements for management plans. They still apply. There's still expectations around those. Yep.
And sorry, it's got Grant online. You got a question, Grant?
Yes, I had a question, similar lines to Peter, actually. The legislation, something that's bothered me for a while is the inadequacy of the setback rules and lack of science around what is a critical source area, what is the extent in area that it needs to be. But I presume that the legislation is the minimum requirements, and that in the approval of a farm environment plan, looking at a specific or site-specific issues, that we could reshape those and extend those requirements and require more information about that.
So this comes to the intersection, I guess, between permitted activities, which is the subject of the intensive winter grazing regulations, and our farm environment plan system, which actually applies to a resource consented system, and where there is a case-by-case assessment of the farm and the sort of setbacks and requirements that might be needed. So they are two quite separate systems. So through the FEP system, and where a resource consent is required, then there is that ability to have a bespoke consideration of that farm, what's required, and then that's audited. But yeah, they are two quite separate systems.
Just related to the permitted activity then, does that bring into play good management practice in terms of industry-wide acceptance of minimum requirements?
No, in the sense that it is a separate standalone standard. However, I would say that in developing our land and water plan, obviously good management practices were a part of that, and a lot of our rules include restrictions or conditions which reflect good management practice.
Right, thank you.
Well, I think it's important to be clear that if most of the intensive farming operations will have consent, and in those consents they are audited for their good management practice regardless of whether they've got a consent for wintering or not. So in our own case, the first thing an auditor does is goes up to the farm where we winter the cows to make sure that we've complied with all those things that are good management practice, some of which were tied up in the regulations. So there is an audited system to make sure that there is compliance with good management practice, regardless of whether you've got an intensive winter grazing consent or not.
Thanks, Ian. I'm just conscious of time, so I know we've got a few more slides to get through. So thank you.
And I think I've really covered the content of this slide anyway, just to be aware that obviously the team were looking at whether or not any change was required through Plan Change 8 around the intensive winter grazing provisions. They're still looking at that, but at the moment it appears that those new standards would address those concerns that were raised in the Council's initial submission. So stock exclusion regulations, those have also been amended. The key change here relates to managing livestock access to water bodies in low slope areas. So those are those areas where land exceeds 10 degrees. There were concerns when those regulations came out that the maps were didn't cover the level of detail that would be required, and that there were some practicality issues with them. So the regulations that have been revoked, just to be clear, these really relate to extensive beef, cattle and deer systems on low slope areas, and also the regulations that apply to exclusion of all livestock from natural wetland areas greater than 500 square metres in area. I will move quickly to the next slide because I just want to assure you that we have our own rules around these activities as well. A lot of the rules that are in the Land and Water Plan around stock exclusion actually include more stringent limits. And to give you an example, we have a requirement for all farm cattle, irrespective of intensity, to be excluded from some sensitive water bodies. So that's things like community drinking water supply areas, freshwater bathing sites, critical habitats for threatened species. So those still stand, and they will still be requirements that are unaffected by these changes. And also our rules that apply to intensively grazed livestock are very similar to the ones that were in the national regulations as well, and they still remain in force as well. In terms of impact, very little impact for both us and for our communities because these regulations weren't in force. They were due to come in force next year, and so there is no impact at the moment, really.
I just got a question. So that wetland 500 square, the wording of that on the slide, I find it quite hard to follow. So the beef and cattle and deer thing, low slope, is to be excluded from any lake or river greater than 1 metre. Can you explain those two? Is there a different way to say it?
Yeah, sure. So
reading that makes my head go bang.
Yeah, it's a very wordy regulation. So they have low slope areas, and within those low slope areas you will have water bodies. And so within those water bodies, beef, cattle and deer must be excluded in both lakes and rivers that are greater than 1 metre in width. So that's where the 1 metre aspect comes. The restrictions relating to natural wetland areas, they apply to a particular size of wetland, but the regulations, the rules in our plan actually don't have a size limitation on them, so they apply to wetlands as defined in our plan, so they don't have a limitation. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
I struggled with replicating that regulation when I was writing this.
Risk of looking ignorant, but low slope also includes no slope, presumably, as in flat.
So low slope is areas that exceed 10 degrees. So it's areas that, it's counterintuitive. It's, yeah.
So sorry, that's all areas that exceed the gradient, including like steeper, so it could be low slope and high slope, but not very low slope and flat. There needs to be some definition in that one.
And Vicky, there were maps put out by the Ministry for the Environment, I think, identifying areas of low slope, and in the hill and high country, that created a lot of issues for the landowners up there.
That's what I'm asking, because I know it wasn't straightforward. One of the terminologies are really confusing.
Yeah, so they have low slope areas and then they have all terrain areas. So there's, So just the last one, and this one just really quickly. So the government has also made a change to pause the rollout of freshwater farm plans. That does not impact our farm environment plan system that we run in Canterbury. That's standalone and separate, and that remains in force. And so this change doesn't have an impact for us. There are only 5 regions in New Zealand that were in the process of rolling out freshwater farm plans. And so I think the key thing here is because Canterbury has its own system, that remains in force. And, farmers will be, part of our communication to farmers is to make sure that you're still looking towards your next audit. And so, just last slide, we will expect some further changes on the horizon. We're expecting the second resource management bill in early December, and we will start to see what the scope of that is. That package of national direction is expected early next year. That will be extensive, 21 instruments, 14 existing pieces of national legislation to be amended and 7 new ones. And so, as I said at the start of this process, we will be going through a phase of considerable change as we implement stuff coming through the system and respond to new changes coming through. That's the conclusion of the presentation.
Thank you. Any other questions? We've got a couple of minutes left. Yeah, no?
Just my question is how take us through the way that so you've engaged with the chairs of the Papatipu. How does that actually? What's the steps actually here in this organisation around the changes, particularly to Papatipu Runanga? How's that being implemented?
In relation to consenting? Yeah, so as Olivia mentioned, we've got a hui set for next week, starting next week, to work through actually what does this mean operationally. And we haven't defined that directly yet because we haven't spoken with our praise on how the changes and what the changes will mean. We have indicated through email correspondence to say that these changes have happened and they will mean that the volume of applications that have been sent through to the entities for consideration will need to change. And that's because a lot of the applications that we're going through were on the basis of a hierarchy assessment, essentially. So we do know that the volume will reduce, that Papatipu Runanga will assess, but we have already put in place notification, not notification in the sense of the RMA requirements, but we use a SharePoint to notify the praise when an application comes in the rohi, and that's all applications. So similar to what we do with our interested parties list, the entities will still get notified on any application that's lodged, but it's the assessment part we need to work out what that looks like because it does need to change. There is still requirements for the iwi management plan to be assessed by applicants, by my planners and by the entities, but we do need to work on what does it look like with the changes to the hierarchy because while a lot of the changes that we deal with are very, very grey, it is very directive in terms of the must not assess for my team. So we do need to work out what the approach is moving forward.
So going all the way back, to the actual changes and how and the effects that they will have on mana whenua input. Did you find the legislation actually quite clear in that aspect, or was it were there grey areas in it?
Which part of the legislation?
You've obviously gone through the RMA changes, okay, that actually affect mana whenua.
I might help here. In the consenting piece, the specific piece around consenting in the hierarchy says must not. It is absolutely clear, Councillor. If you're asking about bigger picture and other things, it is less clear, and that might be the issue I've got. I'm just checking, Aurora, have I got that right? So on this specific item, it is very clear that we cannot use our consenting system as a means of assessing Te Manatua Wai hierarchy. It has been completely disallowed.
And even when the original, where the original legislation actually is not clear, but it's very clear on this particular consenting issue, Te Manatua Wai.
I understand your question, Councillor. We received legal advice when NPS FM 2020 was released that we could, and it was appropriate to utilise the consents process to apply Te Manatua Wai hierarchy, and that is why we utilised it in that manner. This particular piece of legislative change is directed at any council that has done so by virtue of saying you can no longer do so.
So I'm going to watch with real interest actually on how this whole thing is actually going to be managed particularly with the relationship with the Papatupu Runanga, because it's all part of that whole kind of feeling of rhetoric and all of that around this. And I know that we're kind of the meat and the sandwich. I just got to finish with the fact is that the shortly donned Deputy Prime Minister, when he comes into his being, actually has confirmed that Ngāi Tahu have rangatiratanga over water. Saw the Jack Tame thing the other day. So just to leave it at that as well, because that'll be interesting.
See, we have rangatiratanga over the South Island. That's what I think he said. Not just water, everything.
Well, yeah. In this context, let's just talk about water.
Yeah. I'm still like the stock exclusion, but it's still blowing my mind, actually. Is there like a picture that anyone's developed that shows how that actually works in like reality?
I think it'll actually become clearer now that the low slope maps have disappeared.
Okay.
Because it'll effectively mean that we just have regulations that apply to intensive stock on all terrain, and so it will become clearer. But that could be something that we look at as part of our comms in terms of making some graphic to make it clearer.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's all we've got for the session. Thank you so much. Really. Claire, last question.
Not a question, Craig, just a comment to perhaps help you. And Ian alluded to the hill and high country people. In the hill and high country, there is a lot of valleys that are relatively flat, and with extensive livestock on them. And so that was one of the particular issues around that mapping. Huge areas actually of pretty flat land that was caught up in it.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks guys. Awesome overview of all those changes. A lot of things happening in your space. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next up, who I know on my list I've got Catherine, Carmen, and Sonia. So we'll just give a minute or so for people to come up.
Hot seat.
Committee meeting the other day, I referred to the consent application. I think I was still referring to from. I went checked the dates. I thought it was the 25th letter.
It was the 24th.
It was the 25th.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you for the clarification, Councillor.
Hence why it was still being looked at.
Yeah.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Carmen and Sonia. Welcome. I'm going to just hand to you and we'll get into it. I know we've got a couple of minutes over, so sorry about that. But yeah, over to you.
Good morning, councillors. So the purpose of this briefing is to give you the proposed changes to our outcome measures and service measures for inclusion in the draft annual plan. I'm going to briefly introduce this briefing, and then I'll talk to the changes, the very few changes for environmental regulation and protection and community preparedness in response to hazards. And then Sonia will talk through the public transport proposed changes, and then I'll wrap up at the end. So Just to give you some context for this briefing, you'll recall through the long-term plan process, we developed 34 new service measures and we have 26 new outcome measures. So our service measures set the minimum standard for the services we want to deliver to the community. We've just started to report on them quarterly, so you would have received the first quarterly performance report to the Regional Delivery Committee in November. Those service measures are also audited as part of our annual report process at the end of the financial year. For our outcome measures, they're describing our aspirations for the changes we want to see in Canterbury. These aren't auditable, but we'll be reporting on them annually alongside our annual report process at the end of the financial year. So for environmental regulation and protection, we're not proposing to make any changes to the outcome measures. The staff are working hard to update the baselines for those particular outcome measures, and you would have received a copy of the outcome measures for all the core services along with this presentation for this briefing in the pack that you were circulated. However, for the service measures for environmental regulation and protection, we're proposing two changes. So one will be a revision to service measure number 1 following the council guidance yesterday on our planning work program. We will now, following that guidance, we will work with Andrew's team to look at what those measures, the service measure and targets should be for 25-26 and the following financial year as well. So we'll come back to you with those proposed changes. The only other change we're proposing for environmental regulation and protection is just a minor update to the explanation for service measure 5, which this service measure is for our resource users improving their compliance status, as opposed to the methodology being based on compliance grades. We want to change that to align with the risk management matrix that councillors received at the Regional Delivery Committee meeting in November. So it won't be compliance grades, it will be the compliance status based on the risk management matrix. So just to reiterate, we're not changing the service measure or the target, we're just changing the methodology to sit behind that. So for community preparedness and response to hazards, there's no changes to the service measures, but we are proposing one change to the outcome measures. And if we want to go on to the next page, yep. So we're actually proposing that we remove this outcome measure from our list. We have 3 outcome measures in this space already for our seed and work. We've looked at the methodology that we would need to implement behind this particular measure, and it's actually going to be quite impractical to implement. The thought behind it was that we would be going out to all those different agencies and asking them for how they are incorporating the work that we do into their risk reduction and readiness into their decision making. And so there's a capacity issue to implement that, but there's also a capability issue in that we would be applying for the agencies that respond to this request for information. We would then be having to apply our judgment as to how we think they're incorporating the information we provide into their own work. So we feel that the 2 other outcome measures we've got sitting in this space are sufficient to show are we getting the right outcomes for this work, and so we would actually like to remove this one from the outcome measures.
Well, just in terms of the discussion with various parties, will you include Councillor Sunkel as he's the lead on civil defence and stuff, and this does it fall sort of into his, or have you already talked to him?
We haven't spoken to him directly, but we certainly can to make sure he's happy with this.
Given that this is removing the TAs and a number of the policies that we do are critical to the TAs implementing some of those things, is there another way to measure specifically the TAs and how our measures are then incorporated into their measures so that it's delivered? So is there another way we can catch up with that measure?
We haven't specifically looked at that. through the submissions, through the long-term plan, there was one of the TAs mentioned that they didn't feel this was what we should be doing anyway, that we were applying our judgment to the work they do. So there was certainly that feedback that we received through that process. So we've looked at, as the previous outcome measure around a survey with the community, a better reflection of this work, as opposed to asking these other agencies to give us their information and then us applying our judgment, is it sufficient or not. If that's something you want us to consider further, we can certainly take that feedback on board.
No, I'm not sure I want to give you more work to do. There's a lot of work to be done, but I do just want to understand potentially, and I'll take that on to figure out, to think about this from the TA point of view, because they're pretty much the most, in my opinion, the most critical partner in this space, because they're the ones that do a lot of the on the ground work as well as what we do. So, but I don't want to give you more work to do. That's just not what we're here to do right now.
If I might just jump in, councillors, it may be an opportunity with your advocacy to work with the 10 TAs across our region. This is in all of our interests. It was never our intention to play Big Brother or Big Mother or whatever, but it is certainly something that is of benefit to our communities, and perhaps we have a further conversation about how to achieve this and then create a methodology from there.
Grant, you got a question? Then I'll come to you, Vicky.
Yes, I was just wondering, I was thinking of the spatial plan and more from the planning perspective going forward for TAs and ensuring that they are not putting land use activity in harm's way. But I just wondered if is this removal of this, is it covered a bit through climate change, these two climate change reports and strategies that we've got, the Merrill Forum one and our own? Are they adequately covered in those documents in terms of actions?
I would need to follow up on that and look at if that is the case or not, but we can do that.
Yeah, thanks, Carmel.
Okay.
Thanks, Grant. Let's carry on. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Vicky. Sorry.
Sorry, I'll have to keep track of everyone. I'm just wondering, because we've got the risk understanding at the individual level, and then this one you're looking to take out is really about the connectivity with the organisations that ultimately have a connection through to individuals. So there's sort of various routes in which individuals can become informed and supported. So I'm just wondering whether, I don't usually like the sort of measures around numbers of meetings and things like that, but something around our levels of engagement with those organisations, which is really what we can best do, is that communication with those organisations, not actually checking and enforcing whether or not they've then done something with that. And they've all got various levels of statutory responsibility, presumably, which ensures certain levels are met, and they'll have their own checks that's occurring, auditing processes or whatever. But I'm just wondering if there's something that could be sort of less, much simpler to measure, that's within our capability to do, just to check we're keeping the relationships and the connections through each year on that front. Anyway, there's just a suggestion.
We can give that some consideration as well. I feel like you're describing sounds a bit more like a service measure than an outcome in itself. And so I'll need to check back on what their service measures already are that might address this, or is there another way to address this work in the narrative in our quarterly reporting as opposed to making it an outcome measure?
Kia ora, Council. You'll see in your pack that for public transport we're proposing 5 changes to the outcome measures and 2 small tweaks to the PT service measures, essentially to show that improvement over time. It's detailed on the separate slides, but if I just kind of walk you through why are we proposing these changes, essentially it's to make the measures more meaningful. As we've done the additional work to look at the methodology, review the data sources, we've found some challenges. This is not solely for us. This is a national problem in terms of some of these measures. NZTA is doing some additional work through a consultant to look at actually creating some national measures around public transport, which eventually all PTAs will be expected to comply with. Those are still being worked through at the moment. And NZTA have actually changed quite a number of their measures for this year, which is why we're now not aligned necessarily with the NZTA targets. So our changes are, though, aligned with the kind of main PT outcomes that NZTA is seeking. And we've worked it through, and Yasser, our network analyst, has done a lot of work in this space to make sure that these targets really are meaningful, that we've got good data sources, and that we've got a repeatable process to be able to measure over time. So I was just kind of planning to talk to any kind of questions by exception. Is there anything people are kind of keen to talk through rather than cover each slide?
So just on the first of the changes, the subsequent ones. So on this one, and you mentioned about as we transition to the NTS, because of course I know at the moment we've got essentially a flaw in the mechanism in that you can use a gold card to go on the bus, and we don't have those individuals. But the Metro card obviously provides a unique. Although I found I've got 2 Metro cards, it turns out. But anyway, when this is done, people are just using their bank cards and what have you. Is there going to be a mechanism where we can monitor that? That's presumably what you're alluding to here.
Yeah, it is, because essentially with the change to NTS, we allow people then to use a bank card, and obviously there are restrictions around obviously anonymising that data. So what we need to kind of work with the NTS project is looking at actually what data can we get to identify unique users, making sure that we're obviously respecting any kind of privacy agreements. So there will be a way around it. We don't know what it is yet, but that's the kind of plan, obviously, to be able to move into that space so that we can keep tracking. We just found with the old mode share and the way that it was measured, it was just really meaningless in terms of the sample size wasn't statistically significant. And also it looked at people's travel patterns over 2 days, which just isn't really kind of representative of actual travel patterns.
Just give my support to the shift to the percentage of workplaces, and I don't quite know how you measure that, but a distance from your stop to your destination and from your stop to your residence, or so, because I always thought it was a bit of perverse when you give a time, if we get buses that are going on a more direct route in a particular place, all of a sudden you can have people actually living further away, and we treat it as if but that's a big off-put for people if they've got to walk 600 metres instead of 400 metres, say. So I think that's a really much more useful measure that people will can more easily relate to as well. It makes sense to me.
Just on this one here, is that in just bus stops where they're start again? Is that bus stops where we have a active route? There's a lot of bus stops in the city that don't have an active route.
Sorry, yeah, it would be associated with an active route, and essentially we're working with partners to look at where there may be bus stops that are not associated with an active route, and whether that is something we're looking at in the future proofing, or if not, removing.
I think that kind of probably may need to be clear just in that, because active routes and where there's bus stops is a very different. Well, that's what I mean. So let's be careful with that. And then the next one is on the other measure that you had, the percentage of Greater Christchurch population using it at least once in the last year. That's a really good number, 30%. I mean, that's actually really cool. It's nice to see that. But is that really a representative baseline of our active public transport usage in Greater Christchurch? And I just wonder if that's setting up something that's not an actual representative, of active users. You might have somebody that uses the bus once because they wanted to go to an event or something like that, and that could really swing those numbers, one-off events and things like that. So I'm just wondering, is that, in my mind, the best way of doing it, or is there another way you've thought about?
The mode share metric is a really, really difficult metric to measure in terms of being able to have a representative sample. At the moment, this is the best way that we've worked through in terms of being able to kind of look at and recognising the fact that, yep, you will have some people who essentially may have used public transport only once in the last year, and they will count as a unique user. But it does give you an idea of how many people are interacting with the network. And we are looking to increase even if people can use it once a week, once a month, we're trying to get people to kind of just build on that habit. And so this is really showing actually how many people potentially we have as kind of customers, and we can then build on that habit to get them using it more frequently. So it's not a perfect measure, recognizing, but at the moment it's probably the best one we have.
That's fine. But I would like to understand sometime in the future, not now, obviously, you've got enough work to do, but what does our regular usage look like? That would be great.
I mean, there could be a way to do it that you did exclude like those outliers that are like 1 or 2 trips over that year. Get rid of those numbers and see what the percentage is. That could hurt, and it more towards a regular user. So I get what Dion's saying. But it is good to have that number too, actually. This number is really important to have, but as a monitoring method, maybe it is more the regular users. But anyway. Vicky?
Yeah, sorry, I realised there's another slide. The one that's got the service measures and then the targets on it. And there's 2 new ones where we're putting in specifics. And is there some sort of more refined analysis behind just stepping up by 1 each year, and the 20%, 21%, 22%? Is there something behind those, or is it just a random picking? We're just going to go step, because they should be like realistic but also slightly challenging, I would say. And I get the sense that they've just sort of been a little bit plucked rather than really looking at what's feasible. And I know, of course, with the current situation, it's probably that's challenging enough as it is. But in time, maybe we could be more, give me a sense of how much real thought and analysis has gone into that, please.
There could be more thought and analysis gone into it, absolutely. But it is a target at this stage, and as we've baselined, as we move through this process, as we monitor it more regularly, so annually, we will have a much greater understanding of actually where this is sitting. And definitely we need to consider it in terms of there's a lot of moving parts in the system. So at the moment, it hasn't been extensively overanalyzed because this was prior to PT Futures, NLTP announcement, private share revenue. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge before we could kind of have real certainty. But at the moment, it's those targets to kind of show that we're aspirationally looking at increasing the number of trips per capita, particularly considering population growth as well. So we make sure that actually we're keeping ahead of population growth.
I just had a question about the marae
Yes.
D2. Because I realised that the previous one had papakainga in there as well, and now it's just marae. Because I think the point of it would have been where there's an active kainga living around, because not all marae have like a kainga around them. So Ngāhau, for example, doesn't have. I mean, I'm assuming that's on the list because I see 7 marae, and I'm thinking, what 7 marae are in the Greater Christchurch area, and what 4 might have a bus stop outside of them? I'm pretty sure Ngāhau would be one. Yeah, so I'm just thinking like that doesn't have an active kainga around it. So yes, it's a marae, so people go there, but people don't live there per se. Unless, I mean, there are some flats, Kaimātua flats down the back, but yeah, you see what I'm saying? So I think the kainga bit is actually quite important to actually identify kainga as well as marae, because there is a sort of difference.
Yeah, so we'd appreciate any help on this one there's essentially no national database, no definition, there's no...
But we know where they are, so surely we can locate them and then the data can be done from then, because we know where the kainga...
So, we could look at...
I'll be interested to see the list of the 4 and the 7, because...
Yeah, we can provide that, but essentially, we were looking at what's the official... data source that we can refer back to in order to kind of have that clarity. And again, looking at that tangible 400 metres from a active bus stop was kind of the best way we could look at measuring this one. It was a really, really challenging one to look at because essentially we're leading very much in this space. There's no other PTA with such a measure. There's not much clarity around this from a measures perspective just in general. So there's definitely more work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, the bus stop's one thing. It's more where have we located the marae and the kainga and who's done that piece of work, because I think that might require a bit of work with the Papatipu.
So, absolutely.
I'd imagine. Yeah. So, can we maybe follow up on that? Because I think that's quite important before that gets finalised, that we have that engagement so that we know what we're measuring Is that good? I mean, Nook, are you interested in following up on this in terms of working with myself and the team just to go, and the Runanga, where are the 7, or are there more? Have we missed something here? So
Yeah, absolutely. Which is part of, I think our remit to assist wherever we can.
Cool.
I'm like you. I mean, it's marae is marae. Rapaki marae is the marae down below. It's actually the papakaingas around it. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
It is actually.
Yeah, cool. But I just don't have in front of me. But
Oh, no. I was just saying, if the Terreo lessons we've been having, she showed us the integrated map of all the different marae and how, it's very interactive. So that would be a place to start. And then we can overlay it. But
I suppose I'm just more concerned about the removal of kainga, because people don't live in the marae, like in the whare. If it's located at the whare, then people don't live there, but people might live around it, and I think that's interesting. We just need to get the mapping right and the identification right. Yeah, killed it.
Yeah, so we have an opportunity to put it in our remix system, so our network planning system. So once we've got a mapped layer in there, we've got it in there, and we can kind of do this. So yeah, help and support definitely appreciated.
Thank you. And David, I don't know if the Tuia team could help us with this. Thank you. Any other questions or comment yet, Dion? Oh, and sorry, I've got Grant on. I'll go to Grant first. Sorry, Grant, I know your hand's been up for a wee while.
No, this is okay. That's good. Just my questions regarding D1B. Can that come up or not? It's on the other sheet of paper. D1B. It talks about percentage of households in Greater Christchurch within 400 metres of the public transport. I presume, just for clarification, that is households that are along the actual route, as opposed to people who are in the block round the corner or whatever. That's what you're really getting at, isn't it? You talk about network lines, so it's not taking account of people who are just nearby but not on the route.
Do you want to talk to this one, Yessa?
Does that make sense?
Sorry, I'm bringing in our network analyst. I can make it up, but
Kia ora.
I just
yes.
It's just for me. I mean, when it says households within 400 metres of the network, is it as the crow flies, or is it somebody having to walk 400 metres around the corner to a bus stop? That's not, that picks them up at 400 metres. But
yeah, okay. We use the Stat New Zealand data. It's called SAS1. It gives us the data about for the people who are living in a specific geographic area. And we used our current active network bus stops. And this measure on the radius 400 meters as a circle around each bus stop. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, because that's interesting, because that actually implies for the baseline that you're trying to set, you're looking at urban form and the ability of rejigging our urban form to ensure that people across the city have that sort of 400 metre radius, if you like.
Essentially, this is it. It's been a hotly debated topic, the 400 metres. As the crow flies, as you can actually walk, how is this easy to measure? This is a measure and it's a proxy to give you a kind of approximation of how many households have access. Yep, some of it means that they probably have to walk through a house, which is not possible. But actually, this measure was so hard that it used to be part of the district plan, city plan for Christchurch City Council. It no longer is. Yeah. So that's a conversation as well we need to have with Christchurch City, because actually this is not a metric they have. but it's based on a metric they used to have.
Yeah, no, that's my understanding. The NZTA had this sort of 400 to 800 meters, but that actually provides an opportunity for future urban planning. So I think by using your maps and recording these now, or starting that process, you will then over time be able to assess urban intensification issues, as well as redesign of accessibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be able to quite easily see areas that have very limited accessibility. So that becomes very clear in a geographical way. Yep.
Right, cheers.
That actually does raise a question I had around that geographical area where you might not have the accessibility. And to me, it starts raising the question about rates equity and people paying a flat targeted rate right across the city when they don't have access to a bus stop, an active bus stop within 400 metres, and there's 20% of our population that are paying for the same use of a public transport. So I know that people in my community have asked that question already, so I think it might come through.
Yeah, and some of that talks to kind of park and rides, for example, and your kind of access. So whilst you might not be able to walk 400 metres, it may be that you have access. Some people drive to a street, they park, it's informal park and ride, and then they get on one of our core networks. Selwyn, Waimakariri, it's expected we have formal park and rides. So it's kind of looking at how we can look at accessibility more in general. And the rates conversation is, a much wider conversation that could be reviewed.
Yes. I'm surprised. Sorry, in my head, I had just assumed it was walking distance because that's actually what's of importance to people. I mean, I get that you can drive or cycle from further away, and I know my transit app asked me a question yesterday about is there a cycle lock-up at your bus stop, so presumably people are now starting to take interest in that. But in terms of that 400 metres, my understanding is that that's a full number that is considered as accessible, like for elderly people, that they need to be able to sit down, have a bench seat somewhere every 400 metres. There's a rationale to 400, but only if it's actual real walking distance, not if it's a circle. And that you actually can't, you have to walk right round the houses in order to get there, and it actually is more like 600 metres. So, is there an intention to move towards that more real life measure in time, because that's perfectly doable within like a GIS system? That's a measurable thing. It's not actually, I don't think it's even that complicated if you've got the models and your systems are hearing you using a particular system. But
So I guess it is quite complicated because you're measuring every origin to every potential destination around actually how it accesses a bus stop. It's not a perfect measure; it's an outcome measure. So it's a high level measure. I guess some of it is looking at the value versus effort in terms of what is the result of going to the nth degree with some of these measures in terms of what would it actually result in terms of the so what would we be able to do differently. So this at the moment gives us a proxy of, and some people are closer than 400 metres. Some people have many different bus stops closer to them. There's lots that comes into this measure, and I guess the more and more complex we make it, I do recognise it's not a perfect measure, but it's just one that we can measure with the systems and data that we have available at this time.
Yeah, one more, yep.
I'll let Vicky go because I thought it was on the same thing, but I've got one more question on the next slide, the public transport service measure target changes. Your service measure 30 that you've got there, I don't know what the baseline looks like or the results go back further in terms of trends, 86, 87, that's good. But we've just got a flat line of 80. Is there not any way we can, we've got some targets that we've met in the last few years, and we're not going to try and lift that up?
So essentially our fleet is getting older and the ability to put new fleet into the system has been depleted. We've utilised the funding that we have through the SURF. So you'll see the targets are much higher because that represents all the new EVs that we've got into the network. They're looking pretty good. They're looking space age. They're looking very funky. But essentially what we will see now is our fleet is getting older. So a larger portion of our fleet will be just getting older, and we do have targets around when we kind of do a refresh and a refurb, and then obviously we have it when we kind of, they exit the fleet. But that's representative of the fact that our fleet will be getting older over the next 3 to 6 years, and we don't have the funding available to put into improving that as a quality measure.
Cool. Any other questions, councillors? Yeah, it's all right. It's all right, Greg Burns, because you've got Greg's label in front of you.
I'll put him down because I'm not Greg. I don't think I'm anything. Okay, so can you let me know about the impact on the requirement from next year for us to buy purely electric vehicles? Is that still going through? And will that, because those buses are more expensive, is that going to have a bit more of a lag effect on the rest of our network in terms of the depreciate or the lowering of the quality, I suppose?
So I guess you'd always expect some lowering of the quality as the fleet age, but it's all within the RUB requirement. So it's all kind of, it's expected, and there's certain timeframes in which we allocate funding to upgrade the network. The new buses that come in will be the brand new EVs, but we don't have an extensive amount of new buses coming into the network. So we have looked at the profile of the buses coming through so that we do meet the decarbonisation targets. But as it stands, we believe all the targets remain nationally.
Thanks, Dion. Hey, thanks, team. I think that's all the questions we've got, so we've finished a little bit early.
Thank you.
Sorry, you got a couple more? Sorry. I got the next step, sorry.
I'll just wrap up. Any of these amendments to the outcome measures or service measures, they do not need to be consulted on as part of our annual plan process. The staff are working hard behind the scenes to stand up all the methodologies and get that baseline data that you've been asking for. Where it is available, we have got more up-to-date baseline information. We will include that in the draft annual plan. But we will come back to you with a briefing probably in March to talk you through where we've got to with all those methodologies and that baseline information. The sort of final information that we have, if there is more changes post when we go out for engagement or consultation, can still be incorporated into the final version of the annual plan. So we will do our best to get it in the draft annual plan that goes out for engagement or consultation, but we will have the information we need to include in the final draft. We are working towards having our first outcomes report by the end of this financial year we're in now. Okay, just the next steps for the annual plan process. You have 2 briefings next week, one more on public transport fare options, and then the revised fees and charges schedule. So we're really needing final guidance through those next week. We'll then come back to you the following week on the 11th of December with an update of where we're sitting with our draft budgets for the annual plan, and then what that engagement or consultation approach will be like, the potential questions to be involved. The staff will work through December and January to update the annual plan documentation, and you'll receive that in early February for your feedback. We will then have council formally adopt it for engagement or consultation at the end of February, and then working towards the engagement or consultation opening up on the 28th of February. That's it.
Kia ora.
Thank you.
got a few less councillors in the room, but we'll kick off this delegations manual update on our review workshop. And we have David, David and Robin. I was just going to, I know, I always get caught up with that.
Kia ora, councillors, and I won't relay that to my Te Arawa wife with regard to the origins of the Perenara name, but all good. Like I just said to my fellow director, I won't take it personally that we've seemed to have lost a lot of people from the room. This is our second update and engagement with council with regard to our process of updating the delegations. Obviously, the last conversation with council highlighted some key areas, so we're just going to refresh those. So I'll hand over to Robin to walk us through those.
Tēnā koutou, councillors. I thought I'd start with just a brief recap of where we left off at the last session. I outlined at quite a high level the purpose of the delegations manual and why you need to delegate, because obviously you can't do everything yourself, and the LGA is written in the vein of requiring delegations by specifically outlining the delegations that cannot be delegated in terms of Clause 32, Schedule 7. I explained the empowering model, whereby the legislation from central government provides the authority for our council to act. Some of that authority is provided directly to the chief executive. So the council and the chief executive in turn then subdelegate to competent officers to act within the guardrails of the policy which the council sets. And within those guardrails, there's always the provision for significant decisions, and I introduced the significance, engagement and Māori participation policy, which outlines when that significance trigger is hit and the matter will come back before you for a decision. I also introduced the concept of 2 delegation manuals, and that will strip out the council delegations into one manual, and then the second manual will be the chief executive sub-delegations of those authorities to staff. And that's in the interest that the council manual will come back before you should it needs to be reviewed in future for adoption, but the chief executive delegations will be reviewed by the chief executive, and if there's a need within the organisation we can be a bit more reactive, and if the chief executive agrees we can make amendments internally. Set out, these are the principles that are in our current manual, which is a template that's broadly used by most of the councils up and down the motu. They set out the parameters to which all of the specific operative delegations should be referred through. So wherever possible, delegations to staff are made on quite a wide basis. That's obviously because we're a very large organisation covering a very large area and a lot of statutory responsibilities. And that is with the hope that we are performing in the most effective and efficient way to implement the delivery of all of our policies and objectives. Those delegations are generally made under the principle that they go to the lowest level of competence within the organisation, obviously commensurate with the degree of responsibility and difficulty involved in undertaking those delegations. And when deciding how low we do go within the organisation, attention is paid to the responsibilities and the accountability for the correct and effective implementation. So that's taking into account a lot of the assurance pieces, because we wouldn't go so low so that the assurance between the reporting that you get back to council is so wide. So obviously some of them are held at quite a sort of general manager, team leader level. So whilst those delegations are made to individual positions, or I think they're referred to as officers in the manual, it's expected that when it's significant or sensitive, it will be made under that authority, but staff will collaborate in the decision-making process. So we touched on that a little bit last time, where there was the need to, we recently passed the new engagement, significance and Māori participation policy as part of the adoption of the long-term plan. And that really does set out the quite extensive criteria to determine whether a matter is of significance that it needs to come back. Staff also are aware that before exercising any delegation from Council or the Chief Executive, they must bear in mind our responsibilities and relationships with Māori, Runanga and Ngā Pupituhu Runanga. And I've set out the 4 important pieces of legislation that are mentioned in our delegations manual. So you'll be familiar with especially Section 81 of the Local Government Act, which is reflected back into the significance and engagement policy, and that's where the Māori participation element is enshrined in legislation. We also, you should be very familiar with our Turia Relationship Agreement and the Te Waihora Co-Governance Agreement. And that's why I should reflect back to when you receive the council paper, there is a piece that's every paper that you receive has a significance and engagement and Māori participation paragraph towards the end where staff should outline exactly how they have considered the decision that they're asking you and how it measures against that policy and how they've taken that into account and whether or not they've consulted or engaged. So we did touch on this earlier. Council was expressly prevented from delegating some or all of its powers in a particular statute, say the adoption of the long-term plan. The council can delegate the power to do anything precedent to exercise that function. So obviously you're not expected to go around and prepare all the detail that fits behind the long-term plan, but you cannot give up that adoption power. Yes, sorry, it's that just for practical purposes, you couldn't sub-delegate to a committee the adoption of, say, the long-term plan or the setting of a rate, but you are able to delegate all of the powers precedent to the exercise of that power. So that would be, reports from staff, the every information paper that you receive up to the decision, the setting of, I'm just trying to think what else we do in terms of the long-term plan. That means everything preceding up to that decision, but not the authority to undertake the decision. So you could substitute it for prior of that.
Joe, if you're going to have a conversation, there's people online and people may want to watch this over afterwards, so make sure you use your microphone if you're going to be speaking.
Yeah, I'm just seeking clarity around just what that kind of second part of that sentence means around it may delegate the power to do anything precedent to the exercise. Robin's explained. Looking at the word prior may help my understanding.
I think that's good feedback. We are trying to adapt our manual so that it is in plain English and easily understandable by all kamahis. So I think prior is probably a more common parlance than precedent. So when I touched on the guardrails, these are the policies that we spoke about briefly in the last presentation. When a staff member is exercising their delegations, here's the framework that council have set for those decisions. So obviously, they'll be very familiar with the long-term plan that sets out our 10-year direction and service priorities, work programs, and then the resources and requirements for funding of those activities and expenditure over that 10-year period. The local governance statement, which I understand is currently being updated following the reorganisation of the council committees, is a good guideline actually for the members of the public to actually understand what powers the regional council has, and it also provides them with information on how they can engage with the regional council as well in the decision-making process. We've covered the engagement, significance and Māori participation policy, which I think we should maybe think about changing it to be the significance, engagement and Māori participation policy, because it's really quite often the question of whether a matter is significant that triggers the requirement for engagement, but it's academic. We also have the enforcement policy, which is going to be looked at as being reviewed as well. That outlines our approach to all our enforcement activities within the region and ensures that staff are applying a consistent approach to those matters. The revenue and finance policy was also passed as part of the long-term plan. That sets out how our activities are funding through rates, targeted rates, general rates, and it's also a requirement under the Local Government Act. And the 30-year infrastructure strategy was also passed as part of the long-term plan, which sets out our key issues for flood protection over the region. And the policy focuses on a 30-year, but I believe the outcomes are for a 50 to 100-year timeframe in that space. There was some feedback last time around the litigation delegations in particular, and that is the specific delegation that most of our court proceedings fall under, and you'll see that that rests with the Chief Executive. But in the detail beside that delegation, you'll see that there's a lot of discretion that the Chief Executive has to discuss with the Chair, myself, and the officers involved in the particular legal matter. Discussion with the insurers if it's a matter that would potentially need prior notification to the insurers, and then the appropriate reports being made to the relevant committees or to council, and that's the assurance piece that we put through the Audit and Risk Committee. And if the Chief Executive is unavailable, there's provision in the manual for the Director of Corporate and Public Transport Services, the Director of Operations, or myself to exercise that delegation. I would refrain from exercising that myself because I am a lawyer and so I tend to act under instructions, so we may look at revising that in future. There's similar provisions for judicial review proceedings as well. And there was the option that we discussed at the last briefing to expand the current RHC committee terms of reference to act as an advisory panel in relation to certain litigation matters. And that would be with the delegation to remain with the Chief Executive as the decision maker. And the reason why we've put that forward is that that guards against the following risks that we've outlined there, being the perception of bias, the removal of political inference, the separation of the governance functions as outlined in Section 39C of the LGA. The Council has a duty to clearly separate its regulatory from its non-regulatory functions, and the timeliness of decisions, often we're working within quite pressing timeframes, and obviously the importance of legal advice and then maintaining legal privilege where it's appropriate. Oh, you're right. And I understand that the committee itself are to workshop their terms of reference coming up next month, and then they're going to bring that back to council with a view to adopting in the new year. Are there any other issues that we haven't covered?
Joe? Yeah, just some really... it'd be good to have it really clear in the draft around the communications delegations and the process around comms coming out of the building, at what point it moves through the chair, because from my understanding it's not set out in the current arrangement. It's there's kind of a de facto system, but it would be great to have it in writing just for clarity. And so there's going to be two drafts, a CE delegation manual, a council, and then will we get to workshop that before that draft will come? Yes, I guess outline the process. That'd be great.
Yes, so we'll bring back the next iteration with council is to bring back the draft delegations document and for you to see that prior to adoption at then a subsequent council meeting. Just with regard to your question around the communications, you'll recall as part of the Code of Conduct review that we're doing is also, I'm trying to remember this, the public statement policy that Teflon is working on. So we need to look at the delegations manual, the Code of Conduct, and that proposed policy and that in the context of these three things, so that they are all nestled together and there is the clarity, both from councillor as councillors and public statements and things, as well as how those are made internally by staff.
Councillor Edge.
Thanks, Robin. Just a clarification about the slide headed council policy that guides staff decisions. In that, you've mentioned the revenue and financing policy. I'm just looking at the long-term plan, and there's a heading there called funding and financial policies. So just clarifying, of the various funding and financial policies, which includes our treasury policy, that is the only one that council, that the revenue and financing is the only one that council has input in terms of delegations? Or there's treasury policy, fees and charges, schedule, and those other things. It's just the heading of that. Is that sufficient?
I think I use the words such as, so I haven't listed every policy because we do have a fair amount of policies. So our treasury policy does apply. It just probably doesn't apply as operationally day to day as the revenue and finance policy does. So I'm focusing on the main policies. But you're correct. That is a policy that does apply to us at a high level for decision making. Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Councillor Southworth.
And just a comment, and David and I actually had a conversation about this last week, I think it was, just around the way it's laid out in the delegations manual. So I did have a look at another regional council's one, and it was in a sort of tabularised format, and it made it so much easier to read. So I'm sure that's on your radar, but just, I don't know if you've got your ideas already set out now, but
yes. If do you have a particular example in mind that's easy to read? And
I will go back and see which one it was I looked at. But, it might have been Otago, but I'll have a look.
Councillor Robinson, have you got anything to add to this? I know this is something you're interested in.
Not at this stage. There's not a lot of detail in it to discuss. So I look forward to seeing something. Thank you.
Councillor Mackenzie?
Other than when, I think in the last triennium we reviewed the delegations and I was reasonably happy, and I've got no issue with the way we delegate it.
Excellent. And Councillor Mackay, is there anything else you want to add here?
No, I'm pretty happy with the current delegations manual and the way we operate. I just want to make sure that we're always free of political interference, really, whatever.
Councillor Davies.
Just going back to that principle that I was struggling with a bit, I think, because the way I'm reading it, I can see a loophole there. And so just there'll be some kind of legal solution. But that principle just needs a wee bit tidying.
Cool. Only one thing from me is when we introduce the potential concept of these two delegation manuals, will both of those be available on the website?
Yes, they'll both be publicly available, and I think that's important for transparency of decision making. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And it's the only other thing is that the current one is sometimes pretty difficult to find on the website. So maybe just might be something to look at for when we do these next two ones, and just figure out how we can get the metadata behind the scenes to make it Googleable, because it's put it in and you get every other council's delegation menu, and ours is hard to find. So that's only one bit of feedback that I've got. I think we might be. Is that? Oh, sorry, Robin.
I was just going to say, I think we should put it with the policies on our forward-facing website. That seems to come up a bit easier. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else from councillors? Because if not, that would be us. We've finished a little bit early. Thank you, David and Robin, for your time. Thank you, councillors. I think that's the end of the briefings for today. So, thank you very much.